Welcome to The Author Show, where we feature new authors and books, from fiction to self-help and everything in between. You'll find it all at theauthorshow.com. That's theauthorshow.com. And now let the show begin.
Hello and welcome back to the show. This is your host, Don McCauley. Today we're welcoming your program author Bob May, and he is the author of The Scary Storm with Big Bunny and Little Bunny. Before I bring in today's guest, a quick reminder, the selected interviews are available on our iPhone app, which can be downloaded in the App Store, as well as on TV on the Roku channel and Amazon Fire TV. Our app name on all platforms is simply The Author Show. Bob, how are you?
Good.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Well, I'm a retired lawyer and district judge from Texas who moved to Tennessee because at 71, I found out I was going to have a granddaughter. So that's me in a nutshell.
So tell us about your book.
Well, when my granddaughter was about a year and a half, I was taking her down her street in a stroller. And at certain times of the years, the little bunnies pop out. And so we would go bunny hunting, so to speak. And this little story just popped in my head almost instantaneously.
Now, who did you write your book for specifically? Who's your target audience?
It's twofold. One, it's for, obviously, the end reader's going to be boys and girls, maybe 3 to 6, but it's moms and grandmas that buy the books mostly. So people that are looking for content that's rich enough for both the child and the adult to enjoy. I was influenced by when my son was little, we bought a lot of books that you'd read them once and you would never want to pick them up again because they were content void.
So, could you say there's any type of central message or perhaps underlying theme that you would say runs throughout your book?
It's got a couple. Number one, they're books that are designed to demonstrate how values turn to virtues. And values, of course, are what we believe are the proper standards for conduct and behavior and thinking and everything. And then virtues is when you see these characters live them out for you.
So, if you had to choose, what would you say is the single most important idea you're sharing in this book that's really going to add value to the reader's life?
For the little reader, I recently became aware. I read my book before some other authors, and one of them was a doctoral professor in the field, and she said, your book is a SEL lesson. And SEL means social and emotional learning, which I didn't know it until a few months ago. Every school in the country just about has a social and emotional learning curriculum, which is self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And being a granddad, watching little kids and their interactions, I realized that the parents need all the help they can get to have the children learn how to behave. And so these books, although I didn't write them with that intent, that's what they do.
Now, if you could compare this book with any book out there we might already be familiar with, which book would it be and why?
This is going to sound funny to you because this book was written by Robert L. May many years ago. And I'm Robert E. May, or Bob May. And the book was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I would say the similarity, the other reindeer weren't real high on Rudolph until Santa had a crisis and needed Rudolph with his nose so bright to lead him out on Christmas Eve, I guess. So it is a cross between a morality tale like Aesop's Fables and a tall tale like Paul Bunyan and his Blue Ox Babe.
So what inspired you to write your books?
This book, my little granddaughter, was my muse. We were bunny searching, and my first books back in the 80s were my stories for my son, bedtime stories.
So your latest book comes 35 years after the first two books. Why did you wait so long?
Well, I wrote them in 87 and 88, and in 89, and I sold quite a few of them through a small traditional press in Texas. Then I decided to run for district court in Brazoria County, Texas. And to the surprise of everybody, including myself, I won. And so I stayed for as long as I wanted to. I stayed for over 20 years and just didn't run again because I had other responsibilities. You're hearing murder cases and drug cases, and you have all these civil cases you got to hear. It just didn't seem the thing to do to be writing my children's books at the time. So what happened was my sister-in-law found her old copies that she had read to her children, and then she read them to her grandchildren, and the grandchildren loved them. So she encouraged me to get back into writing books.
So, is there any more you can tell us about the characters in the book?
Well, the characters are Big Bunny and Little Bunny, and they are both conspicuously different than all the other bunnies. All the other bunnies pretty much look the same. Big Bunny is not accepted because he's, you guessed it, too big, and Little Bunny is too small. And interestingly enough, Big Bunny and Little Bunny have reconciled to the fact that they maybe can be friends themselves, but they don't need the approval of all the other bunnies. So they're pretty mature, and they become the characters that in the crisis of the scary storm are kind of the heroes.
So, who did the illustrations for the book?
I did them myself. The prior books I've written, I used a wonderful professional illustrator, but he passed away this past year of the effects of cancer and COVID kind of teamed up on him.
So, what have you learned about the impact of pictures in positioning pre-readers and, say, early readers to learn to read?
That's a good question, and it has to do the age limit for a book. I've noticed if you have a really good picture book, a book that's, one side's a picture and one side's text, if it's illustrated correct to the text, the children can figure out what's going on. In other words, the pictures can tell a story, and the text, of course, carries the story a little more detailed. For a pre-reader, you can show it to a 2-year-old and they may enjoy it. Mama can, like I say, interpret it however she wants to. And then eventually those kids will learn how to read, and they'll be reading it to their little brothers and sisters.
What are some of the compliments you've received about your book?
Probably the two that stand out is one lady who was the chief children's library for the county that I lived in back in Texas. She told me years later that they were the best she'd ever seen, the first 2 books. I don't have any belief that that's true or not, but that's what she said. And I didn't know her well enough for her to butter me up or anything. It felt good to hear it. The second compliment was a lady who had a PhD from Peabody, which is part of Vanderbilt, and retired from Middle Tennessee State as kind of a reading specialist. And she told me there's 5 characteristics, which I don't remember them all, of what makes literature. And even though they were children's books, she said they were literature. And so I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. Those made me feel good.
Yeah. So, any more books coming? Are you working on anything now?
Well, I'm writing an adult book right now. I don't know if it's going to be considered a novel or a young adult novel or whatever, but that's what I'm struggling to clear the decks and get seriously into the body of the book. But that's a longer process with editing and things like that.
Now, did your environment or upbringing play any major role in your writing?
Well, my parents were really fine people. My dad was a doctor, my mother was a nurse, and they were really straight arrow type people. They taught us the right values. We haven't always lived up to it, but they taught us values. And I think that understanding what, I'm not talking about culturally normative, I'm talking about behaviorally normal behavior. And a lot of children today are not being raised as much by their parents as they are television, internet, child care people, that kind of thing. And so I think those values have influenced me.
So what can you tell us about this genre and why you started writing in this genre?
Well, it's one of those things that just kind of happened. I originally, back in 87, 88, wrote my first 2 books as bedtime stories for my son. Now, we had purchased a bunch of books and paid good money for them, and they were really well produced and illustrated, but they were basically about anthropomorphic animals, animals that are like people that were behaving badly. And that was supposed to be humorous or something. But I've figured out that children don't need to be taught how to behave badly. They're human beings. It kind of comes naturally. I wanted some books that had good content. It's kind of like we think a lot about what we put in our stomachs, in our mouth to eat, but we need to really think about, for our children, what we allow to enter their little brains and their hearts. And so that's kind of been the motivation, especially since late in life I discovered I was going to be a granddad.
So how would you describe your writing style?
The writing style, people say I do very good characters with interesting names. So I set the scene of the characters and what they do. And then somewhere in the middle of the book, there's a crisis that forms. And in the crisis, that's where change happens often. And so the major characters who have unique gifting, some of them, not all of them, but most of them have some kind of unique gifting, are able to kind of be the figures that help out the rest of their loved ones, community, whatever, to overcome the crisis.
So are your characters based on any real people?
Interesting you should ask, because in the second book, this is not The Scary Storm, but in a book I wrote back in 88, I used a lot of my wife's family out in West Texas. These books were about jackrabbits, and I just took Aunt Jeanette Blatherwick from Midland, Texas. He had a nice store, and she became Aunt Jeanette Bunnywick. And so the major character maybe had characters similar to my father-in-law, and then one of the characters was similar to an oil field boss. So I changed the names to protect the innocent, so to speak. But I used in that book, not so much in The Scary Storm, but some of them are plot driven, and that one had a good plot, but it also was character driven.
So in your opinion, who should buy this book?
I think that your moms, grandmas, and since I'm a granddaddy, I think it's time for men, especially when you're in a household where both are working, it's time for men to step up. Your relational opportunities by reading your grandchild a book or your child a book are amazing. But basically, it's for kids, both boys or girls, 3 to 6. And I think the moms and grandmas, if they're looking for rich content, then this is what they should buy. One of the problems with children's books, and I might have mentioned this earlier, is that many times they're very boring to the adult reader who's reading to a young child. And if they're boring to you, they're probably boring to the child. But in most of my books, I put some little things in there that the adult will understand, the child might not understand, probably won't, but it doesn't distract from the major story and what the child's supposed to pick up.
Do you have a website?
Yes, I do, Don. It's authorBobMay.com. That's M-A-Y for May.
Well, this has been just great. Our guest today has been Bob May, and he is the author of The Scary Storm with Big Bunny and Little Bunny. Bob, thanks very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Don. I really appreciate it.
This is Don McCauley wrapping up another edition of The Author Show. Go out there, buy the book today, and please share this interview with your friends so that they too have the opportunity to discover our guests and their work. The Author Show can be accessed at any time at theauthorshow.com. Selected interviews can also be found on major platforms like Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, and many more. And whether you're an author who would like to be featured or a reader in search of new books to read, The Author Show is a great place to start. Check us daily as we continue to introduce wonderful authors of very interesting books on The Author Show.
Thanks for listening to The Author Show. Find out more about authors and their work at theauthorshow.com. Theauthorshow.com. Tune in next time to another great author on The Author Show.